On a cold winter night in Belgium, something appeared in the sky that should not have been there. No sound, no warning, no explanation, just a massive dark triangle moving silently over homes, roads, and entire towns, while thousands of people looked up and saw the exact same thing. At first, it sounded impossible, a mistake, a rumor, a misidentified aircraft. But then the reports started multiplying, not in one city, not in one region, across the entire country. And the strangest part was not what people saw. It was how perfectly their descriptions matched, even when they had never spoken to each other. 3 lights, a silent triangular shape, and movement that no known aircraft could replicate. By the time police officers began reporting it on duty and military radar started detecting unknown targets in the sky, Belgium was no longer dealing with isolated sightings. It was facing something it could not easily name. And when fighter jets were finally sent to intercept it, the sky gave back an answer no one was prepared for. On a cold Belgian night in late 1989, a routine drive home turned into something that thousands of people would later struggle to describe the same way. No explosion, no warning, just silence in the sky and a massive triangular shape moving above the countryside. That single detail would repeat again and again in the months ahead. At first, the sightings were rare and scattered. A few reports came in from different regions of Belgium describing unusual lights moving across the night sky. But what immediately stood out was the consistency of the descriptions. Witnesses, who had no connection to each other, began reporting the same formation. 3 bright white lights arranged in a triangle, with a dim red light near the center or lower section, and always the same detail followed. Complete silence. There was no engine roar, no helicopter noise. Nothing that matched conventional aircraft behavior. People described looking up at something large enough to block stars, yet hearing nothing at all as it passed overhead. Initially, authorities treated these accounts as isolated misidentifications. Distant in aircraft, atmospheric reflections, or optical illusions were all considered possible explanations. Nothing yet suggested a coordinated pattern, but the reports did not stay isolated for long. Within weeks, similar sightings began appearing across different parts of Belgium. Rural areas, small towns, and suburban roads all produced nearly identical descriptions. Even without communication between witnesses, the core details remained unchanged. 3 white lights, essential red glow, a dark triangular structure moving slowly and steadily across the sky. Some witnesses described the object gliding without visible propulsion. Others claimed it hovered briefly before continuing its movement. A few reported movement that did not match known aircraft behavior, especially when it changed direction without banking or tilting. By the end of 1989, something subtle but important had changed. What started as scattered reports was becoming a pattern that could no longer be easily dismissed. Police stations began receiving more frequent calls. Night patrol officers started logging similar sightings independently. Yet there was still no official public explanation or confirmation of what was being seen, and that uncertainty was about to grow. Because as the sightings continued into the new year, they were no longer rare events. They were becoming a wave. By early 1990, what began as scattered nighttime sightings in Belgium was no longer something isolated or easy to dismiss. The reports were multiplying, spreading across the country in a way that no longer followed a simple pattern of coincidence or misidentification. And the most unsettling part was this: the descriptions were not changing. Across different cities, different provinces, and completely unrelated witnesses, the same structured object kept appearing in the reports, large, silent, and triangular in shape. 3 bright white lights forming a fixed formation, with a dim red light positioned near the center or underside. It was becoming a repeating image in the minds of thousands of people who had never spoken to each other. As January turned into February, civilian reports increased sharply. What once came from isolated rural areas began appearing in densely populated regions as well. Drivers on highways described seeing the object pass overhead at low altitude. Families reported noticing it from their homes while looking out through windows. Even people who initially doubted such claims began coming forward after experiencing similar sightings themselves. The consistency of the accounts began to draw attention. Not just the shape, but the behavior. Witnesses repeatedly described the object moving slowly and deliberately, as if controlled. There was no sound, even when it appeared to be close enough that conventional aircraft noise would normally be unavoidable. Some described it hovering briefly before continuing its movement across the sky, while others noted sudden directional shifts that did not match known flight mechanics. In many cases, people were reluctant to report what they saw at first. The fear was not just of being wrong, but of not being believed. Yet as similar stories began appearing independently across different regions, hesitation slowly turned into confirmation. Something was being seen by too many people in too many places with too many matching details. Local authorities began receiving more frequent calls, especially from rural police stations where night patrol officers were directly witnessing the events. These were trained observers familiar with aircraft, emergency lighting, and common aerial activity. Their reports carried more weight than casual civilian accounts, and they added a new level of seriousness to the growing situation. Still, there was no official explanation. No confirmed identification. No public warning. No announcement that could bring clarity to what was being observed in the skies above Belgium. Only an increasing volume of reports that pointed to the same unsettling pattern. 3 lights. A triangular shape. Silence in motion. By the time March approached, the phenomenon was no longer considered a collection of isolated sightings. It was beginning to resemble something larger, more coordinated, and far more difficult to categorize. And that is when a new layer was added to the case, because now it was not only civilians reporting what they saw, police officers were seeing it too. By March 1990, the reports in Belgium had reached a turning point that changed the entire tone of the investigation. Until this point, the sightings had largely been treated as civilian testimony. Interesting, consistent, but still open to doubt. Misidentification, psychological suggestion, and atmospheric conditions were all still considered possible explanations. Then police officers began reporting the same thing, and that changed everything. On routine night patrols across different regions of Belgium, multiple police units independently reported encountering a large, silent triangular object in the sky. These were trained observers, experienced with aircraft identification, emergency lighting, and nighttime visibility conditions. Their accounts carried a different level of credibility because they were not casual sightings made in passing. They were documented observations made during duty. What made these reports stand out was how closely they matched civilian descriptions. Officers described a large, dark triangular structure moving slowly at low altitude. 3 bright white lights were consistently visible, arranged in a fixed formation with a dim red light near the center or underside. The object was often described as extremely silent, even when it appeared close enough that engine noise would normally be expected. In some cases, officers reported tracking the object for several minutes as it moved across their field of view. The movement was steady and controlled, with no sudden acceleration or erratic behavior. In other cases, the object seemed to hover briefly before continuing its path. What added further weight to these reports was their independence. Different police stations in different parts of the country were recording similar encounters without coordination. The consistency across separate units made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the sightings as coincidence or imagination. Yet even with this growing body of credible testimony, there was still no official explanation. No confirmed aircraft activity matched the descriptions. No military exercise had been announced that could account for these repeated sightings. And no known civilian technology at the time could clearly explain the behavior being reported. As these reports accumulated, the situation shifted from scattered public curiosity to structured concern. The idea that something unknown was operating in Belgian airspace was no longer confined to civilian conversation. It was now being documented by law enforcement itself. This growing pressure led to a more organized response. The Belgian UFO research organization OZBS began actively collecting and analyzing reports, attempting to bring structure to what was quickly becoming a national mystery. And as their files expanded, the pattern became even harder to ignore. Because the sightings were no longer just consistent, they were becoming synchronized. As reports continued to multiply across Belgium, the situation reached a point where informal documentation was no longer enough. The growing volume of consistent eyewitness accounts created pressure for a structured investigation, and this is where the Belgian UFO research organization SOBE stepped in. What they were facing was not a handful of scattered claims. It was hundreds of reports, arriving from civilians, police officers, and multiple regions that showed no clear connection to each other. And yet, the descriptions kept matching. SOBEPS began systematically collecting testimonies, organizing them into structured case files. Each report was analyzed for timing, location, altitude estimation, object shape, and movement behavior. As the data accumulated, investigators started noticing something unusual. The sightings were not random. They were forming clusters across specific time windows and geographic zones. Witnesses consistently described the same core features: a large triangular object, 3 bright white lights arranged in a fixed formation, a dim red light near the center or underside, and most importantly, a complete absence of sound during flight. The consistency was not limited to appearance alone. Behavior patterns also began to repeat across independent accounts. The object was frequently described as moving slowly, hovering briefly, and then continuing in a controlled, steady direction. Some witnesses reported sudden changes in direction that did not resemble conventional aircraft motion. As OBETs compiled more data, the scale of the phenomenon became clearer. This was no longer a handful of isolated sightings. It was a coordinated wave of reports that spanned the country. Media attention began to increase as well. Local news outlets started referencing the growing number of sightings, which in turn encouraged more people to come forward with their own experiences. This created a feedback loop where reporting increased visibility and visibility increased reporting. Despite this growing documentation, there was still no official explanation from military or aviation authorities. No confirmed identification of the objects was provided. No public statement could fully account for the consistency of the reports being gathered. SOBEX could document what people were seeing, but they could not explain it. And as March approached, the frequency of sightings began to intensify further. What had once been a wave of reports was now building toward a single night that would define the entire phenomenon. A night when the entire country seemed to look up at the same sky and report the same object at the same time. By the end of March 1990, Belgium was no longer dealing with scattered sightings. The pattern had intensified into something far more coordinated, with reports increasing in frequency and credibility almost week by week. Tension was building quietly across the country, even though no official explanation had been given. Then came the night of March 30th, 1990. What happened that evening would become the most documented and widely discussed phase of the entire Belgian UFO wave. It began with multiple independent police reports arriving almost simultaneously from different regions of Belgium. Officers on night duty began describing a large triangular object moving across the sky at low altitude. The most striking detail was that these reports were not isolated or delayed. They were synchronized in time, coming in from different police stations within the same operational window. As more calls came in, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Different witnesses, separated by distance, were describing the same object passing over multiple locations in sequence. The consistency in timing and description suggested that whatever was being observed was large enough and slow enough to be tracked across regions in real time. The object was described the same way each time: a dark triangular shape, low-flying, with 3 bright white lights and a faint red light near its center or underside. And once again, the most repeated detail was silence. No engine noise. No familiar aircraft sound. Just movement across the sky. Local authorities quickly escalated the situation. At this point, the volume of reports was no longer manageable at a local level. Coordination between stations began to form as they attempted to confirm whether they were observing the same object from different vantage points. The possibility that multiple observers were tracking a single aerial event became increasingly likely. As the night progressed, civilian reports began matching police observations. Drivers, residents, and night workers across Belgium all began reporting the same triangular object moving through the sky. The convergence of these accounts created one of the most concentrated clusters of UFO sightings in Belgian history. The situation escalated further when military involvement was triggered. Belgian Air Force units were alerted due to the number and consistency of radar-related reports and visual confirmations from ground observers. This led to the deployment of F-16 fighter jets to investigate the airspace. What followed would push the incident beyond anything previously recorded in the wave, because now, trained pilots were entering the same airspace where multiple independent witnesses were reporting the same unknown object, and the radar would soon begin to show something that no one could easily explain. As the night of March 30th, 1990 continued, the situation moved beyond civilian reports and police confirmations. For the first time in the Belgian UFO wave, the response shifted into military airspace operations. The Belgian Air Force ordered F-16 fighter jets into the sky. Their mission was straightforward: identify and intercept the unknown objects that had been repeatedly reported across multiple regions and confirmed by ground radar stations. What made this deployment unusual was not just the frequency of sightings, but the consistency of radar anomalies being reported alongside them. For the pilots, this was no longer a distant civilian phenomenon. It was now an active air operation. Once airborne, the F-16 pilots began coordinating with ground radar controllers. Almost immediately, radar operators detected unidentified contacts moving through Belgian airspace. These targets did not behave like conventional aircraft. They appeared to change altitude rapidly and shift position in ways that did not match standard flight patterns. At times, the radar returns suggested sudden acceleration. At other moments, the object seemed to slow or reposition almost instantly. The movement was described as highly irregular and difficult to track consistently. However, there was a critical complication. Despite the radar confirmations, pilots reported something very different. They could not visually lock onto a clear target. In several instances, pilots were directed toward radar contacts, but when they reached the expected location, they saw nothing identifiable in the sky. No lights, no silhouette, no clear aircraft structure that matched the radar readings. This mismatch between ground radar and visual confirmation became one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire operation. On the ground, controllers continued to track objects that appear to move unpredictably across the radar screens. In the air, pilots attempted multiple intercept approaches, adjusting altitude and speed according to instructions, but still failed to establish a confirmed visual identification. The situation created a growing contradiction. Radar systems were indicating the presence of something real and highly mobile, yet the pilots, trained to visually confirm and engage aerial targets, were unable to verify what the instruments were detecting. As the night progressed, frustration and uncertainty increased within the operation. The object or objects being tracked did not behave like known aircraft, drones, or atmospheric phenomena documented at the time. Eventually, the mission concluded without a clear interception or identification. But the data remained. Radar anomalies had been recorded. Multiple air and ground units had tracked unknown movements, and yet, no definitive explanation could be confirmed in real time. This would later become a key point of debate in official reviews, because even though the Belgian Air Force would eventually publish a report on the incident, one thing remained unchanged. They could confirm something was there, but they could not say what it was. After the intensity of March 30th, 1990, the Belgian Air Force was left with a situation that could not be dismissed as simple misinterpretation or isolated error. The night had produced multiple radar anomalies, coordinated air operations, and repeated attempts at visual confirmation by trained pilots. In the weeks that followed, these events were formally reviewed. The Belgian Air Force compiled operational data from radar stations, pilot reports, and communication logs from that night. The goal was to determine whether the unidentified targets represented a technical malfunction, known aircraft activity, atmospheric interference, or something outside conventional explanation. The findings confirmed an important detail. Unidentified radar contacts had indeed been recorded. Ground radar operators documented objects that appeared to move across Belgian airspace in ways that did not match known flight behavior. These movements included sudden changes in speed and altitude, as well as directional shifts that were difficult to reconcile with conventional aerodynamics. However, when cross-referenced with pilot reports, a contradiction remained. While radar systems consistently tracked unknown objects, pilots were unable to establish visual confirmation of any solid, identifiable craft matching those signals. In multiple instances, aircraft were guided toward radar positions, but no corresponding object could be seen in the air. This mismatch became one of the central issues in the investigation. Despite the presence of recorded data, the Air Force did not reach a definitive conclusion. The official report acknowledged the radar anomalies and the operational difficulty in identifying the targets, but it did not classify the objects as hostile, known, or conclusively real in physical form. No single explanation fully accounted for both the radar behavior and the lack of consistent visual confirmation. Technical malfunction was considered, but it could not explain all recorded patterns. Atmospheric conditions were examined, but they did not align with the structured tracking data. Known aircraft activity was also ruled out due to the absence of matching flight records. In the end, the report stopped short of making a final determination. It confirmed that something had been detected, but it did not confirm what that something was. This official uncertainty had a strong impact on public discussion. For supporters of the phenomenon's significance, it reinforced the idea that something unknown had entered Belgian airspace. For skeptics, it highlighted the limitations of radar interpretation and human observation under uncertain conditions. But the most important outcome was not agreement. It was that the case remained open. And as investigations slowed, another layer began to shape the story: public debate. Because outside of military reports and structured investigations, a new wave of interpretation, skepticism, and controversy was already forming around the events of that night. As the Belgian UFO wave faded from its most intense period, the investigation did not end with a clear answer. Instead, it shifted from active sightings to interpretation, debate, and disagreement about what had actually happened in the skies over Belgium. With time, the mystery became more complicated, not less. One of the first major challenges came from the growing number of inconsistencies in public material. While thousands of witnesses had reported similar triangular objects, not every piece of evidence carried the same weight. Among the most circulated items were photographs that were claimed to show the mysterious craft. At first, these images appeared to support the reports. A dark triangular shape with lights, captured against the night sky, quickly spread through media coverage and public discussion. But later analysis changed the story. One of the most well-known photographs from the period was eventually admitted to be a fabrication. It was revealed that the image had been constructed rather than captured as a direct observation of the phenomenon. This disclosure became a turning point in public skepticism, as it raised questions about how much of the visual record could be trusted. At the same time, skeptics began offering alternative explanations for the entire wave. Some argued that the sightings could be attributed to misidentifications of conventional aircraft under unusual lighting conditions. Others suggested atmospheric effects, such as cloud reflections or optical distortions, which can sometimes create structured-looking patterns in the night sky. There were also theories centered on psychological and social factors, including mass suggestion, where early reports influenced later witnesses to interpret ambiguous lights in similar ways. However, none of these explanations fully accounted for the scale and consistency of the reports. Particularly difficult to dismiss were the coordinated police observations and the radar data recorded during the March 30th incident. These elements continued to fuel disagreement between skeptics and researchers, as each side emphasized different parts of the evidence. For UFO researchers, the wave represented one of the most structured and widely documented aerial mysteries in European history. For skeptics, it was a combination of human error, misinterpretation, and a few confirmed cases of deliberate deception, amplified by media attention. Over time, the intensity of the debate faded, but the case itself never fully disappeared from discussion. The Belgian UFO wave remained unresolved in the strictest sense. No confirmed aircraft was identified, no definitive explanation was universally accepted, and no single theory managed to fully account for every layer of testimony, radar data, and photographic controversy. What remained instead was uncertainty, a collection of consistent human observations, official radar anomalies, and unresolved contradictions that together formed one of the most debated aerial mystery waves of the late 20th century. And even decades later, one question continues to follow the case: not what people thought they saw, but what, exactly, moved silently across the Belgian sky in 1989 and 1990, leaving behind so many witnesses and so few answers.